Over the past several months, we have been discussing off and on this concept of discipleship. We have talked about how being a disciple involves having a devotion or a zeal to the good works that God has created us for. We have talked about how it is characterized in our lives through godly living and being a people that are being produced with God's work in us, producing a fruit of that. And we also talked a little bit about how this affected the early Christians, how they heard these words, they heard what Jesus did, and they were taught the gospel, and that did something in them. They were described as a people that weren't of this world. They didn't belong here. They were described as a people who had an unconditional love for one another, even though they had great and vast differences in their lives together. And they had an unquenchable love for the lost. They wanted to save as many as they could. And they were a people who had a deep, deep trust in their God, even though oftentimes the lives that they lived would put them into situations that were not just uncomfortable. They would have to weigh the cost of whether or not they were going to stand for their beliefs or die. And they would hold to that trust that God was greater than this world. That is what we are called to be. Well, it's just read for us. The Great Commission, we think about this as a call to evangelism, but it is also a reminder of to what we are to be. Go and make disciples, Jesus told the 12, the 11. Go and make disciples. That's what you and I are to be. That's what we are to be creating in the world around us. We are called to discipleship, and we might hear that and think about the things that we've just talked about and what we've considered over the past several months and think if only Jesus had known how difficult that was going to be, how hard it was going to be devoted and zealous for works in a culture that has gotten so twisted and gotten so many things wrong. If only he knew how hard discipleship would be, certainly he would not have called us to that. He would have called us to membership. And don't we like to think about it that way more? I am a member of, as opposed to I am a disciple of. Because as a membership, we get the card that says, hey, I belong to this, and we use that membership for the benefits that it gives us, but we also can cancel at any time, no fees required. We are happy with the concept of a membership. But culture makes discipleship hard. We must remember that in the midst of that, Jesus has called us to discipleship. But also, I want us to reflect on a little bit about what the early church was born into. Was their culture and their culture wars that unlike our world today? I want to argue that the disciples produced discipleship, and it wasn't just a product of the culture. There may be this sense of, well, things were more quaint back then. I was having a conversation with Tim, I believe, the other day about the idea of people just showing up to your house, and you just have somebody show up and y'all talk for hours, and that was just something, you could do that back in the day because things were just a little bit more quaint. And things must have been a little bit more quaint back then for hospitality and love and all of these things that are born out of the first century church that we see. Well, what was their culture like? I want to say that it wasn't, discipleship wasn't a product of the culture they were in. It was a product that was in spite of the culture. In spite of a culture that waged war against the very things that they became, God produced these fruits in them. And if we can understand that, I think we can see, well, he can continue to produce those fruits in us today. So we're just going to look at three areas. Let me get my fingers right. Three areas in which we're going to see the culture was at war against the church in those days. We could look at countless others, but I think these three are some that we will greatly connect with in ways. The first one that we're going to consider is something that runs fairly true for every society, and that is family. The family is the centerpiece of almost all cultures throughout history. And in the first century, that was the same, but marriage was also very similar to what we see today. You had marriages that were good and marriages that were bad. You had marriages that were filled with unhappiness. You had marriages that are filled with selfishness. And so the problem of divorce is not a problem that we deal with just today. It was very common then as well. In fact, there was a sense in which in the first century and second and third century churches, that's kind of what we're looking at today, is these early churches. Within this body of believers, there was a culture around them that had become accustomed to unfaithfulness. That was just a part of life. In fact, what we might consider very scandalous today was not very scandalous then. It was just kind of the societal norm. A writer by the name of Tertullian, we're going to reference him several times through the course of this. He is a 2nd to 3rd century believer. And here's what he wrote during the time that he lived. Women long for divorce, as though it were a natural consequence of marriage. Now, I want you to consider for a minute why he might have wrote this. Why this might kind of explain, or what culture might kind of explain behind this comment. At the time of the 2nd and 3rd century churches, arranged marriages were still a thing. That wasn't something that was just done in Near Eastern religions. That was something that took place in Rome as well. It wasn't uncommon for newlyweds to have met one another and really know very little, if anything at all, on their wedding night. And it was also not uncommon for there to be large age gaps between husband and wife. And they come into these situations, and I think we can kind of step back and see that and think, well, it's a little bit understandable how these two, especially with our notion today of you got to get to know each other before you can decide whether you're not going to be compatible for a life together. It's a little bit understandable maybe that we see that divorce was such a rampant and welcomed option within these situations, oftentimes which led to mistreatment of one or both members of the family. But not only was it a problem with we don't know each other very well, we kind of been put into this, and I'm with someone that I really don't know if they're here for my benefit or if they're just here to benefit them in some way. But there was the sense that faithfulness to this marriage was only dependent upon what I received. There's all sorts of record within history of the ways in which they viewed their marriages, especially the husbands viewing their wives as only being beneficial and carrying on the family name. But whenever I'm looking for a good time, I go to this place. And whenever I'm looking for other sorts of interaction, I have people on the side for that. A very common concept within that 1st and 2nd and 3rd century world. Something that maybe we see is not quite that different from the world that we live in as well. I think we might even be able to say that justifying a divorce in this early Roman society may have actually been even easier. All the efforts that we've gone to kind of make this easier in our world, and no-fault divorces and everything that we see to kind of pave the pathway for this may have actually been even easier during this time to justify the splitting up of husband and wife. So what did the church do with this? This is the culture they live in. How did they respond to this? Another writer, a man by the name of Origen in the 2nd and 3rd, same time period, said, "What God has joined together, let no man separate, neither government nor any other power, for God who joined them together is more mighty than all others that a person could name or even conceive." It would seem that during the early church, Christians in those days had taken Jesus' words to heart. We are disciples. Teach them to observe all things that I have commanded. What did he command us? Well, in Matthew 19:9, for example. In Matthew 19:9, he said, except for the cause of adultery or sexual immorality, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Early Christians took an attitude that is counter. It ran counter to the cultural view of what was acceptable. And I like to think that that's still true. For the most part, I like to think that's still a true thing. We look on divorce and go, that's not an option. We don't treat it as an option. It's not something that we have in our back pocket and say, okay, things get bad and I don't like it. I'm just ready to fling this out at any point. I think for the majority of the church, that is a truth statement. But through the course of this sermon, I want you to be asking yourself this question. Do I agree with this, and do I hold this because I am a disciple of Christ, or do I agree with this and I hold this belief because it is part of the culture that I live in? Maybe it's countercultural to most of American society, but I come from a conservative culture. So what I'm asking you to think about is this: am I a disciple or am I a conservative? I want you to think about that as we go through these. Another one that I want us to consider, a place where Roman society and our society kind of run parallel, there's great similarities here, is the concern for unwanted pregnancies. In a recent election up in Ohio, it revealed a majority view towards this issue, a topic that the Ohio voters chose to approve a constitutional amendment to ensure access to abortions. They described it this way. They described it as a making available of reproductive health care. That is a disgusting attempt to beautify the Holocaust that's going on within our culture, our society, by this way. And what I want you to know is that is not new either. That is something that is history is filled with examples of. It is the age-old tactic to make to appease our consciences when we're doing that which we know is wrong. You go all the way back to the days of early Israel and the worship of Molech and Chemosh. As you see this worship going on, one of the things that becomes clear is that part of that was offering up of a child. The offering up of a child as a sacrifice to these gods. And as these childs would be brutally killed, drums would be beaten and trumpets would be blown. And screams would go out, chants and shouts to try to cover up what they were doing. And we can understand the horrendous nature of that. It puts a pit in your stomach to think about. Calling abortion reproductive health care is akin to the same thing. I want us to see what it was like in Rome. Unwanted pregnancies were dealt in one of three ways. One was the smothering of a newborn child. Two was a process called exposure, where a newborn child would just be left out on the side of the road in a field for whatever may happen to it. And three was abortion. One that I was kind of surprised to find was just as common then as it was today. Mark Felix, who was a second century Christian lawyer, he wrote this: "There are some women among you who by drinking special potions extinguish the life of the future human in their very bowels, thus committing murder before even giving birth." The concept of taking something to put out that life, a poison, this was something that these Christians lived in. This isn't new. This is the culture that they had amongst them, the same culture that we still continue to live in today. Now, this idea of exposing children was something that was more common, it appears, in history. And there is a place called the Catacomb of Praetextatus. And in this catacomb, they have found countless burials, many of which have no names. They recognize that some of these are children. And of the children that are buried there, some 88 children, only 5 of them have a name, indicating that the rest of these, they had no one who maybe cared to give them a name. There is one, though, an older person, not a child, that has the name Stercorius. And there's very little doubt, based just solely upon the name, there's very little doubt about the history of this person. Stercorius, very kindly translated, means little one abandoned in the garbage, or probably more accurately, abandoned in the filth. It's no doubt that Stercorius was one of these children who had been left exposed. But as was apt to happen, people would go by and pick these people up. They would do that for the purpose of using them as slaves. They would find these children and they would take them so that they could try to use them for their benefit, to put them into their workforce, to make money off of them. But there's also accounts of little children buried in these catacombs with this moniker. Adopted son. Didn't expect that. Adopted son or adopted daughter. Because another thing that history is replete with are the examples of the first, second, and third century church, who despite their culture, which said these do not matter, these children that were left in the fields, these children that were left in the garbage piles, these children that were literally left out with the refuse, sometimes only able to be brought into the home long enough to be given a proper burial, were being taken by these Christian families and being cared for. History records this sometimes through the unfavorable view of the world that would recognize that these churches gather up the unwanted children of the world, no doubt for the purpose of consuming them at their religious feasts, because what we know today as the Lord's Supper, the idea of partaking of the flesh and the blood of the Son of God. There was these accounts that we find in history of the belief that that was the reason for gathering up these children. I want to suggest today that that is obviously not the reason they were taking them. We know what they used for those emblems. Instead, what we see is a people who were so impacted by the culture around them to move, to act, that they adopted the process of adoption. I want to suggest that they did that because they recognized something about the God that they followed. If you look in your Bibles to Ezekiel chapter 16, there is a disturbing passage. But I want you to think about it in light of what we've just talked about with the idea of exposed children. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 4 through 6, it says, "As for your birth, on the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water or cleansed. You were not rubbed with salt or even wrapped in cloths. No eye looked with pity on you to do any of these things for you, to have compassion on you. Rather, you were thrown out into the open field, for you were abhorred on the day you were born. When I passed by you and saw you squirming in your blood, I said to you, while you were in your blood, live. Yes, I said to you, while you're in your blood, live." Now, this passage talks about the formation of the nation of Israel. That's what God was discussing as He gave this message to Ezekiel to share with these people who had fallen so far from what God had made them to be. People who are now in Babylonian exile, and we're hearing this message in a time when they thought God has completely given up on us. Comes the message of how they were first formed to begin with. He talks about how their father and mother were Amorite and Hittite, and yet from that came this people who seemed like they didn't belong and seemed like they were unwanted, and God reached out and did something with them. Something that we would call today adoption. He took them and He cared for them. And He loved them. And as that passage goes on to reveal, He loved them in the ways that they most desperately needed. And Christians realized that that's me. That's what God has done with me. He has adopted me. He has taken me in. And so in a culture that made it very common to say, this is unwanted, this is not needed, I don't desire this, came forth disciples with a heart towards adoption. Let's look at one more. One that maybe seems far less significant than the last two that we just talked about. In the first, second, third, fourth centuries, the way that one spent their pastime was a huge part of the culture, as it continues to be today. And we might think of entertainment and have views that just simply don't really line up with what history reveals. You know, there's accounts of kids playing games where they have a hoop that they kick down the road with a stick and try to keep it spinning. Or you might think, well, how do you spend your time? And try to think of very wholesome ways. But throughout history, we've been really talented at finding quite unwholesome ways to keep ourselves appeased when we get bored. And Rome was certainly no different. Upper class Rome put a great importance on leisure. This was the chief of ways to be entertained. Gluttonous banquets consisting of sometimes 22 courses with delicacies such as pig udders and peacock tongues. Wow. This is the life of the upper class of Rome. This is what we're living in. This is what life was all about. Adding to that, what do? We go to theater. That's a common thing for us to do in Rome. Find a place that we can go and enjoy being cheered up by the dramedies and the comedies of the day. Things which oftentimes consisted of themes like crime and adultery and other forms of sexual immorality. One particular comedic theme was what I can only best describe, and I'm being as trying to just be as vague as I can be, the transitioning of virgins. This was the highlight. You think, what's going to make money today? Like, what's going to be a box office hit? We're going to talk about Marvel. We're talking about these movies that gets everybody's attention. This was the big ticket items in the day of Rome. Mimes would act out adultery. Situational comedies were the idea of being in love with a prostitute and all the zany antics that would go along with that. This is the picture of Roman theater. And Licentius, a 3rd and 4th century writer himself, he was a Roman teacher who converted to Christianity later, said, "I am inclined to think that the corrupting influence of the stage is even worse." Now, even worse than what? What's he talking about? What's he comparing it to? He's comparing it to the arena. The arena was the melting pot. This is where upper and lower class come together to witness a good time. Rich and poor alike could sit and enjoy games designed to quench the unquenchable, the Romans' undying thirst for violence and brutality and blood. Chariot races were carried on with the hope of the great crash that was going to lead almost always to a death, the impending death of the driving team. Animals would be brought out to fight other animals. Let's see if we can pair up things that don't oftentimes get brought together. A couple of lions versus a great bull. A pack of wolves and an elk. Let's see if we can bring these animals together to have them fight one another. And then when that wasn't enough, let's put men in here to go and try to chase down these animals and kill them. Or let's starve the animals and put men in to see what the animals do to them. Now, that was almost always those that were despicable and undesiring, and oftentimes it was the Christians of that day that met that fate. This is the arena. This is the entertainment of the day. Now, all of this led to what we have found great interest in, and sometimes even entertained by ourselves, the idea of the gladiator. But I want you to think about how this same 1st century Licentius, we're going to look at something else that he says about this. And I want you to think about what he says. I'm not saying that Licentius is inspired. I'm not saying that any of these men are inspired, but I just want you to think about how one believer in this period, amidst this culture, the way that he talked about and the way that he stood out against the backdrop of what was Roman entertainment. Now, this is a long read, and I'm not putting all of it on the board. I just want you to listen to this. He who finds it pleasurable to watch a man being killed, even though the man has been legally condemned, pollutes his conscience just as much as though he were an accomplice or willing spectator of murder committed in secret. Yet they, Rome, call these sports where human blood is shed. When they see men placed under the stroke of death, begging for mercy, can they be righteous when they not only permit the man to be killed, but demand it? They cast their cruel and inhumane votes for death, not being satisfied by the mere flowing of blood or the presence of gashing wounds. In fact, they order the gladiators, although wounded and lying on the ground, to be attacked again and their corpses to be pummeled with blows, to make certain that they're not merely feigning death. The crowds are even angrier with the gladiators if one of the two isn't slain quickly. As though they thirst for human blood, they hate delays. By steeping themselves in this practice, they've lost their humanity. And therefore, it is not fitting that we who strive to stay on a path of righteousness should share in the public homicide. When God forbids us to kill, He not only prohibits the violence that is condemned by public laws, but He also forbids the violence that is deemed lawful by men. I want us to think about these different areas of Roman culture and the way that they looked at these different topics. And then I want us to think about today. What do disciples do today? Do we take an uncompromising stand towards our entertainment? Is our entertainment filled with violence and crimes and sexual immorality? Do we let God's word be our heart and beyond to guard our eyes and our ears? Or are we more content to say, as long as it's not rated R? And even then. If that's the case, I'm going to suggest that the MPAA has become more of our source of authority when it comes to what is righteous as opposed to the Word of God. Will we stand and be disciples? Now, we could go on all morning long. There are several other topics. The Roman view on modesty and fashion. And I'm going to tell you, when you go into that and you start digging into modesty, what you find very quickly is the early church is not talking about what wasn't covered. They were talking about what was put on to draw attention and to glorify self. What was the disciples' stance against Roman modesty? What about the Roman view of evolution? Darwin does not hold the market on evolution. We need to understand that. How people viewed and how the Roman culture viewed what man was is what led to the arena, by the way. Is what led to the mistreatment when we were nothing more than just a highly evolved animal ourselves. Or the problem of equality. Treating people different because of their race, their class, their education. These are problems that are not just witnessed. That is the culture. It's not just that we can see examples of it. This is what the church was born into. This is what it was raised in. This is what it grew in. This is the culture that also called out and said, these men have come here and turned the world upside down. I hope that we see our culture is not that different. But what about our discipleship? Because all these cultural issues stood out. They existed, but Christians stood out in the midst of them. So today, let's ask another question. Does the church of today, does it stand out from the culture? Or are we simply trying to reflect something that we deem, maybe we deem it countercultural, but it's causing us to lose our focus on what we've been called to be? Are we trying to reflect a certain party? Does that become our goal? At the beginning of this, I ask you to think about that. For many, the desire doesn't seem to be, I want to be a disciple of Christ. It's, I want to be a conservative. I'm not saying that those two can't run hand in hand. I'm not saying that there's not senses where disciples are going to have very conservative, in the picture of our culture, very conservative thinking on the idea of family structure, on gender roles, on sexual relations, on human dignity. All of these things run hand in hand, but conservatism is not discipleship. And Satan would love nothing more than for you to think that it were. He would love nothing more for you to be the greatest conservative believer there ever was. And again, I'm not saying they don't oftentimes run together. but I'm saying we are called to something more. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Screwtape Letters, he's writing about, so The Screwtape Letters is a book writing about the effects or the attempts of the forces of Satan to control and capture the mind of a man. And so he's writing and he's talking about this concept where the man has become a churchgoer. You have this younger demon and he says, I don't know what to do now. He's a churchgoer. I'm in trouble. And so here was the response from his uncle, his mentor demon. He says, I think I warned you before that if your patient can't be kept out of the church, he ought to at least be violently attached to some party within it. Now, C.S. Lewis writes this in the backdrop of the Great World Wars. And this idea of parties that he's discussing, he addresses early in the book, the party of extreme pacifism and also the party of extreme patriotism. But what he's suggesting is that what Satan would love is even though we come and we gather together within this building and there is the singing of praise of God and there's the opening of His Word and there's time spent praying to Him, that what we're really here for is to find somebody who agrees with me on these cultural things. Like today, find people that think like me conservatively. That's what I'm really here for. And at the end of all that, what we're really talking about is membership. Just people who are card-carrying members of the same club that I belong to. That is not what we've been called to. We have been called to discipleship. And if we're here today and we're going, I want to move beyond that. I don't want to be a member of the conservative party. I want to acknowledge the things that view holds that are true to God, but what I really want to do is be a disciple of Christ that despite the culture is going to stand and glorify Him, knowing who my God is, knowing what He has done for me. I want to give you 2 points and the sermon is yours. We'll be done. 2 points on how we can get there. Number 1 is we have to understand that discipleship inherently includes suffering. The first, second, third century churches suffered greatly because they stood out against the culture. They suffered greatly because they took a stand against the things that the culture said were acceptable, were pleasant, were worthwhile. Matthew chapter 10, verse 38 through 39, maybe a verse that comes to mind, may have been a verse that words that echoed in their minds as they stood in front of those that found it okay to just destroy the marriages that they had been bound to by God. He who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. And he who has found his life will lose it, and he who has lost his life for my sake will find it. John the Baptist died for his stance for marriage. Countless other Christians followed suit. In Romans chapter 8, verses 15 through 17, Paul wrote, "You have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with Him, so that we may also be glorified with Him." The early church understood what Paul was talking about. Glory doesn't come by escaping all the displeasure of this world when you take a stand for truth. Glory comes from being made like your Savior, like your Christ, who was made to die for the sins that you and I have committed. Now, connected to this understanding, that discipleship inherently involves suffering. And that if I'm going to be a disciple of Christ and I'm going to stand up against a world that has made it increasingly okay to live in a way that does not honor and glorify the Father, that's going to be hard, that's going to be painful. But I'm not going to be alone. Jesus said, make disciples. But then He also told those 11, do not forget that I am with you always, even to the end of the age. We are not alone. Because discipleship is fellowship with God. Romans talked about that passage in Romans 8. He said, do not forget that you have become adopted as sons of God. You cry out, Abba, Father. You have a relationship. You have a God who is your Father, who is with you, who cares for you, who loves you, who has good intentions for you. But in Galatians chapter 2, verse 20, they also recognize, as Paul wrote, I have been crucified with Christ. I'd argue that's the idea of discipleship, that we understand its suffering. We're being crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. In the life which now I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. These churches recognize I'm not doing this on my own. They recognize that God played a part in this. And while we need to be very clear that we have taken a stance throughout history, we've taken a stance against forms of doctrine which will completely minimize to the point of extinguish the role that man plays in our relationship with God. That He has called us to obedience, and we are therefore going to play a role in that. We must never minimize the role that God plays. Doing so is to cause us to become weak and frail and purposeless. It is the reason why we won't be disciples, because we won't recognize that God Himself is our Father. We are in a relationship with Him, and it is His Son that lives in us as we follow after Him. And lastly, Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 through 13. My beloved, just as you have always obeyed, not in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who is at work in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. What prompted the early Christians? What prompted the early churches to take a strong stand against the culture? Not to just kind of flow with it, not to become a part of it. For so oftentimes you see Christians today that just look like the world around them. They act like them. Our entertainment's the same. Our thinking is the same. We just become a part of this world. What was it about this early church that caused them to stand out from that? I would argue it was these teachings right here. They recognized who their God is. They recognized what He was calling them to. The Bible teaching that suffering is not something to run from, to be fearful of, something that is to be accepted because it is a sharing with God Himself, with Christ who suffered for us. The understanding that we are God's family, that He is our Father, that Jesus Christ, His Son, resides in us. Earlier in Philippians 2, Paul wrote this. He said that I am confident that He who has begun a work in you will continue it, will complete it, will bring it to maturity. I am confident of this, brethren. Our culture is counter God. We can be counter-cultural by being disciples of Jesus Christ, by following after Him. And if we will allow God to begin that work in us, I am confident that He will bring it to completion. You are not alone. Yes, it may bring hardship, but it is hardship weighed out in the eternal view of glory. Can we assist you this morning in coming to Him and becoming a disciple of Jesus Christ today? It would be our greatest desire to do so. Come forward and we'll talk about it together as we stand and sing.